The rain lashed against the window of Dr. Eleanor Vance's small, sterile apartment, mirroring the tempest within her. Dust motes danced in the anemic light, filtering through the perpetual gloom, illuminating stacks of forgotten books and a half-empty mug of cold tea. For months, this had been her sanctuary, or perhaps her self-imposed prison. Since it happened, the world outside felt too loud, too vibrant, too full of reminders. Eleanor, a historian whose life had once been defined by meticulous research and passionate lectures, now found solace only in the quiet decay of forgotten narratives. Her once sharp intellect, however, still yearned for a challenge, a distraction potent enough to silence the echoes of her personal tragedy, a void she refused to name, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. One Tuesday, amidst the usual deluge of academic junk mail, a heavy embossed envelope stood out. It bore no return address, only a stark, almost archaic seal. Inside, a single sheet of thick parchment announced a rare, unprecedented opportunity, an exclusive solitary research residency on Alcatraz Island, unparalleled access to the prison's deepest archives, untouched for decades, was offered to a scholar of exceptional merit. The letter was signed by a shadowy historical society Eleanor had only vaguely heard whispers of, known for its reclusive members and obscure grants. Eleanor stared at the words, a flicker of something akin to morbid curiosity stirring within her. Alcatraz, the Rock, a place synonymous with isolation, despair, and the crushing weight of human confinement. For most, it would be a chilling prospect. For Eleanor, it was an irresistible siren song. The idea of being utterly alone on an island, steeped in such profound human suffering, far from the sympathetic glances and well-meaning, but suffocating condolences of her colleagues, felt like a perverse form of salvation. It was a place where her own internal desolation might finally find a fitting external landscape. She needed to escape the ghosts of her present, and perhaps the ghosts of the past could offer a strange, unsettling comfort. Within a week, the arrangements were made with an unsettling efficiency. The society seemed less interested in her specific research proposal and more in her willingness to embrace the solitude. On a gray, blustery morning, Eleanor stood on the San Francisco Pier, the city skyline a distant, hazy memory behind her. The ferry, a small utilitarian vessel, cut through the choppy bay waters, carrying only her and a taciturn ferryman whose eyes seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken stories. As Alcatraz loomed larger, its stark, concrete silhouette against the churning sky was less a landmark and more a monolithic tombstone. The air grew colder, heavier, even before they docked. Stepping onto the island, Eleanor was immediately struck by the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature, but a profound, unnatural hush, as if the very air had absorbed the screams and whispers of decades past. The ferryman simply pointed towards the main prison building, then turned and left, the chugging of his engine fading quickly, leaving Eleanor utterly alone. Her assigned quarters were in a secluded, rarely accessed section of the administrative building, adjacent to the old warden's office. It was Spartan, yet functional, with a narrow cot, a sturdy wooden desk, and a single barred window overlooking the churning bay. As she unpacked her meager belongings, a faint, rhythmic scratching began. It seemed to emanate from inside the thick stone walls, a persistent, unnerving sound. Eleanor paused, her hand hovering over a stack of books. Rats? Unlikely, given the building's sturdy construction and the island's strict pest control. She pressed her ear to the cold stone, the scratching momentarily ceasing. Then, with a chilling shift, it resumed, now from the opposite wall, closer to her head. It felt less like an animal and more like something toying with her, testing the boundaries of her composure. She dismissed it as the building settling, or her own nerves, a familiar trick of isolation. Later that evening, after a meager meal and a futile attempt to connect to the mainland's internet, Eleanor began to arrange her research notes. She ran her hand along the rough, uneven surface of the wall beside her desk, a habit born of her tactile nature. Her fingers brushed against a small, almost imperceptible recess, hidden beneath a loose piece of plaster. Curiosity piqued, she pried it open. Inside, nestled in the dust and grime, was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. It was no bigger than her thumb, its features worn smooth by time, yet it felt strangely warm in her paw. Its eyes, two tiny, dark knots in the wood, seemed to possess an unsettling depth. It wasn't listed in any inventory she'd seen, nor did it seem to have any historical significance. It was just ... there, a forgotten trinket. She placed it on her desk, a peculiar weight settling in her stomach. Its presence was unsettlingly specific, as if it had been waiting for her, a silent sentinel in her private space. She couldn't shake the feeling that this little bird, with its ancient, watchful eyes, was more than just a piece of forgotten wood. It felt like a secret, waiting to be revealed. And as the scratching sounds resumed, faint, but undeniable, from somewhere deep within the walls, Eleanor felt the true, chilling embrace of Alcatraz begin. The wooden bird sat on Eleanor's desk, a silent, unsettling companion. Its tiny, dark eyes seemed to follow her, a constant, unnerving presence that dwarfed the vastness of the empty prison around her. The rhythmic scratching from within the walls had continued intermittently throughout the night, a phantom sound that defied logic, shifting its location as if an invisible creature were scuttling just beyond her reach. Sleep offered no respite. Her dreams were a fractured kaleidoscope of cold stone, the metallic clang of cell doors, and a pervasive, suffocating sense of dread. She would wake with a gasp, the phantom weight on her chest, a chilling echo of the dream, her heart hammering against her ribs. Eleanor, ever the academic, tried to rationalize. The old building settling, her own exhaustion, the power of suggestion in such a notorious place. But the logical explanations felt increasingly flimsy, like thin paper against a rising gale. She needed to anchor herself in her work, to immerse her intellect in the tangible history of Alcatraz. The next morning, armed with her research briefcases and a thermos of bitter coffee, Eleanor descended into the prison's main archive. It was a cavernous, dust-laden space, rows of steel shelves crammed with inmate files, guard reports, and administrative documents. The air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and a faint, metallic tang. Her initial focus was broad, cataloging the various psychological assessments conducted on the prisoners. She sought patterns, commonalities in the descent into madness within the rock's unyielding confines. It wasn't long before a name began to surface with disturbing regularity: Elias Thorne. His file was thicker than most, overflowing with psychiatric evaluations, disciplinary reports, and increasingly frantic letters to a non-existent family. Thorne, a bank robber with a history of profound paranoia, had been transferred to Alcatraz after a violent breakdown in another federal prison. His records painted a chilling portrait of a man meticulously stripped of his sanity by the island's isolation and the relentless, unforgiving routine. He believed the walls whispered to him that the guards were part of an elaborate conspiracy, and that unseen eyes watched his every move. As Eleanor delved deeper into Thorne's case, a strange resonance began to hum within her. His descriptions of the whispers and the eyes mirrored her own nascent anxieties. She found herself subconsciously tracing the outlines of the wooden bird on her desk, its silent watchfulness suddenly amplified by Thorne's documented delusions. His journal entries, scrawled in a deteriorating hand, became her particular obsession. They were a chaotic jumble of desperate pleas, furious accusations, and chillingly specific descriptions of his torment. One afternoon, hunched over Thorne's brittle journal, Eleanor felt a cold draft despite the sealed archive. A whisper, faint but undeniably clear, brushed past her ear. "She knows." It was fragmented, guttural, yet distinctly male. Eleanor froze, her breath catching. She spun around, but the archive was empty, save for the towering shelves and the dust motes dancing in the sliver of light from a high window. Her heart pounded. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the acoustics, a phantom echo of the prison's past. But the whispers continued, growing bolder, more frequent. They seemed to emanate from the empty cells around her, forming fragmented sentences that pierced the silence. You failed her, alone, like him, the price of silence. Each phrase was a direct, chilling reference to her own unspoken personal tragedy, a wound she had meticulously kept hidden. How could these whispers know? It was impossible. Her mind, she told herself, was playing tricks. The stress, the isolation, the morbid history, it was all converging. That night, the dreams intensified. She wasn't just hearing Thorne's panicked breathing. She was in his cell, the cold, damp stone pressing in on her. The phantom weight on her chest became crushing, a suffocating pressure that made her gasp for air, even in her sleep. She thrashed, trying to break free, but the invisible force held her down. When she finally jolted awake, drenched in sweat, she found her hands instinctively clawing at her own chest, as if trying to push something off. A new, terrifying detail emerged from Thorne's journal. Among the frantic scribbles and paranoid ramblings, she noticed a recurring doodle, a crude, almost childlike drawing. It was a bird, identical to the wooden one on her desk. The same two dark knots for eyes, the same simplified shape. Eleanor stared at the journal, then at the wooden bird, a cold dread seeping into her bones. Thorne had drawn it obsessively, repeatedly, always accompanied by phrases like, "It watches," or "The eyes see everything." The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a forgotten trinket. It was a symbol, a connection. And the fact that she had found it in her own quarters, a place Thorne had never occupied, suggested a deeper, more insidious link. The scratching from the walls, the whispers, the dreams, they weren't random. They were escalating, becoming personal, and the wooden bird, once a mere curiosity, now felt like a conduit, a malevolent key to the prison's darkest secrets, or perhaps to the unraveling of her own mind. The isolation was no longer a comfort. It was a tightening noose. The wooden bird, now a chilling focal point on Eleanor's desk, seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent energy. Its connection to Elias Thorne, undeniable after her discovery in his journal, had shattered the last vestiges of her academic detachment. The scratching in the walls was no longer a phantom sound. It was a rhythmic, deliberate scraping, as if something was trying to claw its way out. The whispers, once fragmented, now coalesced into a low, guttural murmur that seemed to follow her, echoing her unspoken fears. "You let her go. You let her fall." They hissed, twisting her personal tragedy into a barbed accusation. Eleanor's sleep was a battlefield of waking nightmares. The phantom weight on her chest, now accompanied by the stench of decay and the sensation of unseen hands fumbling at her throat. Driven by a desperate need to understand, to fight back against this encroaching madness, Eleanor plunged deeper into Thorne's records. She ignored the hunger pangs, the exhaustion, the growing tremor in her hands. She was no longer just a historian. She was an investigator, a detective unraveling a century-old crime against sanity. Her search led her to a series of heavily redacted documents, tucked away in a forgotten subfolder labeled Special Cases, Experimental Psychology. What she uncovered sent a jolt of ice through her veins. Thorne hadn't merely suffered a breakdown. He had been subjected to a controversial, highly unethical experimental psychological treatment. It involved prolonged sensory deprivation, isolation in extreme conditions, and the systematic use of psychological manipulation designed to break the most resistant inmates, to strip them of their will and individuality. The goal, chillingly, was to create a perfectly compliant prisoner. The methods described were barbaric, a slow, methodical torture of the mind. As Eleanor read, her own isolation on the island felt less like a coincidence and more like a cruel, deliberate echo. The moment she unearthed these details, the prison seemed to awaken. A heavy steel door in the distance slammed shut with a deafening clang that reverberated through the stone corridors, followed by a cascade of falling debris. In her quarters, a stack of her meticulously organized research papers suddenly flew from her desk, scattering across the floor as if struck by an invisible force. Eleanor gasped, scrambling backward, her eyes wide with terror. A distorted, fleeting apparition of Thorn flickered in the periphery of her vision. A gaunt, terrified face, eyes wide with a madness that mirrored her own growing fear. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind a lingering scent of stale sweat and fear. The entity, whatever it was reacting. It seemed to want to prevent her from revealing its secrets, or perhaps, in its torment, it desperately wanted her to understand. Eleanor felt a profound, terrifying sense of being chosen, targeted. Was this a literal ghost, the tormented spirit of Elias Thorne, or a powerful psychological imprint, a residual energy of his suffering that had latched onto her own vulnerability? The distinction no longer mattered. The terror was undeniably real. Later that afternoon, needing a break from the suffocating archives, Eleanor ventured into a rarely used section of the prison grounds, near the old power station. She found an elderly man, Mr. Henderson, meticulously oiling a rusty generator. He was a relic himself, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a faded blue. He introduced himself as the last remaining civilian maintenance worker, a man who had seen Alcatraz in its heyday. "You're the new historian, eh?" He rasped, his voice gravelly. "Not many come here for long. The Rock, it keeps its secrets." Eleanor, desperate for a human connection, however brief, asked him about Thorn. Mr. Henderson's eyes clouded over. "Ah, Thorn. Mad as a hatter, that one. But not always. They did things to him. Things that would break a saint. Used to hear him screaming. Not just screaming, mind you. Begging." He paused, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "He used to carve little birds. Everywhere. Said they were watching him. Said they were the eyes of the island. Crazy talk, of course." Eleanor's blood ran cold. The bird. Mr. Henderson confirmed its significance to Thorn. "One night," Mr. Henderson continued, his voice barely a whisper, "after one of their treatments, Thorn just changed. He stopped screaming. He just sat there, staring. And sometimes I'd hear him whisper, 'It's free now. It's free.'" Mr. Henderson shivered, despite the mild air. Never saw him again after they took him to the infirmary. Just gone. As dusk began to settle, casting long, eerie shadows across the prison yard, Eleanor thanked Mr. Henderson and headed back towards her quarters, the old man's words echoing in her mind. She was halfway across the main yard when a blood-curdling scream tore through the silence. It was Mr. Henderson. The sound was raw, primal, abruptly cut short as if a hand had clamped over his mouth. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. She spun around, her eyes scanning the darkening grounds. The scream had come from the direction of the maintenance shed. Panic seizing her, she ran, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. She burst through the shed door, her breath ragged. The shed was empty. The air was thick with the metallic tang of fresh blood. A dark, glistening pool spread across the concrete floor, still wet and viscous. Eleanor stumbled back, gagging, her hand flying to her mouth. Lying in the center of the crimson stain was a single mangled wrench, its handle bent at an impossible angle, unmistakably Mr. Henderson's. There was no sign of him. No struggle, no body, just the chilling evidence of a brutal, unseen force. His disappearance was never explained. leaving Eleanor utterly, terrifyingly alone on the island. The last human link to the outside world severed. Back in her quarters, shaking uncontrollably, Eleanor frantically gathered her research notes, desperate for some answer, some escape. As she shuffled through a stack of Thorne's photocopied documents, a folded piece of paper slipped out. It was a cryptic note, written in what appeared to be Mr. Henderson's shaky, aged handwriting. It read, "He knew. The bird. It watches." The words confirmed her deepest fear. Mr. Henderson hadn't just been a witness. He had been aware of the same disturbing symbol, the same malevolent presence. And now he was gone. The island wasn't just haunted. It was a living, breathing entity, and it had claimed its latest victim. And Eleanor, alone and terrified, knew with a chilling certainty that she was next. The metallic tongue of Mr. Henderson's blood still clung to the air, a visceral reminder of the impossible horror Eleanor had witnessed. His cryptic note, clutched in her trembling hand, felt like a burning coal. He knew. The bird. It watches. The wooden bird on her desk seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, its carved eyes now truly malevolent. Eleanor was no longer just alone on Alcatraz. She was alone with it. The island was no longer a refuge. It was a cage, and the entity, whatever it was, had just demonstrated its terrifying reach. Sleep became a luxury she could no longer afford. Every shadow held a lurking threat, every creak of the old building a potential manifestation. The rhythmic scratching within the walls intensified, sounding less like claws and more like desperate fingers, scrabbling to get out or in. The whispers were no longer fragmented. They were a constant, insidious murmur, weaving themselves into the fabric of her thoughts. You let her fall. You didn't save her. Just like them. They were Thorne's words, yet they were also her own deepest, most agonizing regrets, amplified and twisted by the island's despair. Eleanor's grip on reality began to fray. Her vision blurred at the edges, and the familiar lines of her quarters seemed to waver, replaced by fleeting, distorted images of cell bars, shadowed figures, and the contorted faces of those involved in her personal tragedy. She saw her deceased loved one, not as a memory, but as a spectral figure in the corner of her eye, their face etched with the same terror she'd seen in Thorne's apparition. The island was no longer just mirroring her grief. It was actively replaying it, forcing her to relive the trauma within the confines of Alcatraz. Desperate for a voice of reason, for any connection to the sanity of the outside world, Eleanor tried to call Dr. Ben Carter. Her phone, which had previously struggled with a weak signal, now seemed utterly dead. She tried the old landline in the warden's office, a relic she'd hoped might offer a more stable connection. The dial tone was a comforting sound for a moment, then it dissolved into static, a cacophony of white noise that slowly, chillingly, began to coalesce into Thorne's guttural whispers. She's gone. Because of you, you failed. The voice was raw, accusatory, and unmistakably Thorne's, yet it was also Ben's, distorted and mocking. The phone slipped from her numb fingers, clattering to the floor. The line was dead. Her last link to external help, severed by an unseen hand. She was truly isolated, driven by a sudden, frantic impulse, a fragmented memory from Thorne's journal about the hidden eye. Eleanor found herself drawn back to Thorne's old cell. She ran her hands along the cold, damp stone, searching. Behind a loose brick, near the grimy window, her fingers brushed against something metallic. She pulled it out, a small, antique camera, surprisingly intact, though coated in decades of dust and grime. It was an old model, the kind that used film. A flicker of hope, however irrational, ignited within her. Perhaps Thorne had documented his torment, a tangible proof of his sanity, or what remained of it. She remembered an old, disused darkroom in the prison's basement, mentioned in a historical blueprint. It was a long, terrifying trek through pitch-black corridors, the whispers now a chorus around her, the air thick with the scent of decay. She fumbled for the light switch in the darkroom, bracing herself for failure. But with a sudden, inexplicable surge, the old fluorescent tubes flickered to life, bathing the room in a sickly green glow. It was as if the island itself wanted her to see what was on the film. With trembling hands, Eleanor developed the role. The first few images were blurry, indistinct. Then they began to sharpen. Photos of Thorne, taken by himself perhaps, or by someone else in the cell. His face, initially gaunt and weary, grew increasingly distorted, his eyes wide with a profound, unhinged terror. He was clearly documenting his own descent into madness. Eleanor's breath hitched as she looked at the final, most horrifying picture. Thorne was staring directly into the lens, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fear. But it wasn't just him. In the blurred background, barely discernible in the shadows, stood a faint, translucent figure. A woman. Her hair was long, dark. Her posture was familiar. It was Eleanor. Her own face, ghostly and indistinct, was visible behind Thorne, her eyes fixed on him with an unnerving intensity, as if she had always been there, an unseen tormentor, a silent witness to his unraveling. The image flickered, then solidified. Eleanor stared at her own spectral reflection in the photograph, a scream catching in her throat. The experimental treatment Thorne underwent, the sensory deprivation, the psychological manipulation. Was it possible that the island itself, or some lingering residue of those experiments, was now affecting her in the same way? Was she not just being haunted, but becoming the haunter? The line between history and hallucination, between external ghost and internal torment, vanished. Eleanor dropped the photograph, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The whispers in the cell block outside seemed to swell, a triumphant chorus. "You're one of us now," they hissed. "Welcome home." She was trapped, not just by the island's shores, but within the crumbling confines of her own mind. The ghost of Alcatraz, now inextricably linked to the ghost of her past. The photograph lay crumpled on the darkroom floor, a horrifying testament to Eleanor's unraveling sanity. Her own face, a ghostly specter behind Thorne, mocked her from the image. The whispers from the cell block had swelled into a roaring cacophony in her ears, a triumphant chorus of welcome home. The wooden bird on her desk, now back in her quarters, seemed to thrum with a malevolent energy, its eyes burning like tiny, twin embers in the encroaching darkness. The line between external haunting and internal breakdown had not just blurred. It had dissolved entirely. Eleanor was no longer Eleanor. She was a vessel, a stage for a horrific replay, or worse, a new performance. The entity's true, malevolent intention became terrifyingly clear. It wasn't just haunting. It was seeking to possess her, to relive its torment through her, or to complete some unfinished, horrific act that Thorne himself couldn't. It wanted to consume her, to make her another tormented soul chained to the rock. The physical manifestations escalated with brutal aggression. Doors in her quarters, previously secured, violently slammed open and shut, creating deafening reverberations that rattled her teeth. Objects, heavy research tomes, and even her laptop flew across the room with sickening force, smashing against walls. Eleanor ducked, screaming, as a heavy, antique inkwell whizzed past her head, narrowly missing her temple. The air grew frigid, thick with the stench of decay and a cloying, metallic scent that reminded her too vividly of Mr. Henderson's shed. Thorne's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a guttural growl, directly in her ear, urging her, commanding her. Finish it. End the pain. Yours, mine. It was a terrifying fusion of his madness and her own deepest despair, twisting her grief into a weapon against herself. She felt unseen hands, cold and skeletal, pulling at her hair, dragging her across the rough concrete floor of the cell block when she dared to venture out. Sharp, burning scratches appeared on her arms, welts rising on her scalp, undeniable proof of a physical assault by an invisible assailant. She was being physically tormented, her body as much a battleground as her mind. Driven to the brink of complete psychological collapse, Eleanor knew she had to escape. This wasn't just about understanding Thorn anymore. It was about survival. She had to get off the island. Her only hope lay with the small, dilapidated service boat docked at the hidden cove. Rarely used, but perhaps her last chance. Under the cover of a sudden, violent storm that whipped the bay into a frenzy, Eleanor stumbled through the driving rain, the wind howling like 1,000 tormented souls. The island seemed to actively resist her, the path slick, debris flying, the very air pushing her back. She reached the cove, her heart pounding with a desperate, fragile hope. The boat was there, bobbing precariously in the churning water. But as she clambered aboard, her hope turned to ash. The boat was sabotaged. The bilge was filled not with water, but with a viscous, dark liquid that smelled of decay and something sickly sweet, like stagnant blood. It sloshed around her ankles, chilling her to the bone. On the seat, nestled amidst the putrid liquid, lay a single decaying tooth, yellowed and cracked. It was a clear, chilling message. She was not meant to leave. The entity had anticipated her move, sealed her fate. Just as despair threatened to consume her entirely, a faint light pierced the swirling fog. A small, old-fashioned dinghy, battling the furious waves, was approaching the island. Eleanor squinted through the rain, her breath catching. It was Dr. Ben Carter. Against all odds, against every warning, he had come for her. A surge of overwhelming relief, pure and blinding, washed over her. He was her last link to sanity, to the world she had left behind. "Ben!" she screamed, her voice hoarse from terror and exhaustion. He spotted her, his face etched with concern, and skillfully brought the dinghy alongside the dock. Eleanor scrambled out of the sabotaged boat, reaching for him, tears streaming down her face, indistinguishable from the rain. "Eleanor, my God, are you all right?" Ben cried, stepping onto the dock, his hand outstretched. But before their fingers could touch, his eyes widened in sudden, profound shock. A gasp escaped his lips, not of pain, but of disbelief. A single deep stab wound loomed on his chest, as if from an invisible assailant, a dark crimson stain spreading rapidly across his jacket. He stumbled, his eyes locking onto Eleanor's, filled with a desperate, dying message. "It's real. It's inside you," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm's roar. Then, with a shuddering breath, Dr. Ben Carter collapsed into Eleanor's arms, his body going limp, his eyes staring blankly at the tumultuous sky. He was gone, dead, her last connection, her only hope, brutally extinguished by an unseen force that had now reached beyond the island's shores. The entity had claimed another victim, proving its terrifying power was not confined to the rock, but could strike anywhere, anytime. Eleanor was truly, utterly alone, trapped with a malevolent force that had just demonstrated its ability to affect the outside world, and the chilling implication that it was indeed, as Ben had whispered, inside her. The island was no longer just a prison. It was a tomb, and she was buried alive. Dr. Ben Carter's lifeless weight in Eleanor's arms was a cold, brutal anchor, dragging her deeper into the abyss of Alcatraz. The storm raged, mirroring the tempest in her soul. His dying whisper, "It's real, it's inside you," echoed in her ears, a horrifying prophecy. She was not just alone. She was infected, a host for the very horror that had consumed Thorn, and now claimed Ben. The island had not merely haunted her. It had chosen her, and it was preparing her for its ultimate purpose. She collapsed onto the dock, cradling Ben's body, the rain washing over them, mingling with her tears and the fresh blood. The wooden bird, which she'd instinctively clutched, felt impossibly heavy. radiating a malevolent heat. The whispers, no longer just in her head, seemed to emanate from the very air, from the churning bay, from the stone walls of the prison itself. They were a cacophony of Thorne's guttural growls and the accusing voices of her past, all screaming the same words. Murder! Failure! You let her die. Eleanor scrambled away from Ben's body, a primal scream tearing from her throat. She stumbled back into the main cell block, seeking refuge in its familiar, albeit terrifying, architecture. But there was no refuge. The entity was no longer a subtle presence. It was a grotesque, shifting entity, manifesting directly before her. It writhed in the air, a shadowy, indistinct mass that pulsed with dark energy. Then it began to solidify, its form constantly morphing. First, it was Elias Thorne, his face gaunt, his eyes wide with the same unhinged terror Eleanor had seen in his photograph. His mouth opened, a silent, agonizing scream. Then, with a sickening ripple, his features dissolved, reforming into the face of her deceased loved one, contorted not in peace, but in agonizing accusation, their eyes wide with the terror of their final moments. The entity shifted again, becoming the face of a doctor from her past, his expression one of judgment and disappointment. Each transformation was accompanied by a fresh wave of psychological torment, forcing Eleanor to relive the most agonizing moments of her personal tragedy. You could have saved her. Thorne's voice boomed, layered with the voices of her past, echoing off the cell walls. You hesitated. You were too weak. Eleanor screamed, clutching her head, trying to block out the onslaught. But the entity wasn't just showing her visions. It was forcing her to physically reenact the trauma. She felt her body move against her will, her hands reaching out, grasping at empty air, then recoiling in horror. She writhed on the cold concrete floor, sobbing, as the entity forced her to experience the crushing weight of her failure, the agonizing helplessness she had felt in that moment. It was as if her mind had become a puppet, and the entity, a sadistic puppeteer, forcing her to dance to the tune of her deepest guilt. Feel it. The entity roared, its form now a swirling vortex of tormented faces. The pain, the regret, it's all yours. Eleanor was pushed to the absolute brink of irreversible madness. Her sanity fractured, splintering into 1,000 pieces under the relentless assault. She was on her hands and knees, gasping, tears and snot streaking her face, her body trembling uncontrollably. Then, amidst the swirling chaos of torment, a new image pierced through the horrifying tableau. Not a tormentor, but a silent observer. In the corner of her vision, in the shadowy depths of a nearby cell, stood Mr. Henderson. He was not mangled or bloody, but trapped, his body covered in the same strange, symbolic carvings from Thorne's journal, the same carvings that adorned the wooden bird. His eyes, though wide with a mixture of terror and a strange knowing peace, were fixed on Eleanor. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't accusing. He was simply watching, his gaze filled with a profound understanding. He raised a trembling hand, slowly, deliberately, and mouthed a single word. Free. The word echoed not in her ears, but directly in her mind, a beacon of clarity in the storm of her breakdown. Mr. Henderson wasn't dead in the conventional sense. He had been absorbed, transformed, perhaps even released from his earthly torment by the island's influence. His death had been a transition, a strange form of liberation. And now he was telling her that she too could be free, not by escape from the island, but by confronting the very thing that bound her to it. The realization hit Eleanor with a blinding flash. The ghost was not just Thorne, nor was it some external supernatural entity. It was a manifestation of her own unresolved guilt, her suffocating grief, her deepest fears given terrifying form by the island's history of despair and confinement. Alcatraz, with its legacy of breaking minds, had acted as a catalyst, allowing her inner demons to take on a terrifying, externalized form. The horror was not outside her. It was inside her, given life by the rock. The entity before her, still shifting between Thorn and her loved one, now seemed less like an external threat and more like a monstrous, distorted reflection of her own tormented soul. This was the ultimate reckoning. The psychological battle had reached its terrifying peak. She had to fight, not the ghost of Alcatraz, but the ghost within herself. She had to face the truth, accept her failures, and somehow find a way to forgive herself or be consumed forever. The word free resonated in Eleanor's mind, a single pure note cutting through the discordant symphony of her torment. The grotesque, shifting entity before her, a monstrous reflection of her own guilt and grief, still roared its accusations, but its power felt different, less absolute. The image of Mr. Henderson, trapped yet serene, his body etched with the same symbols as the wooden bird, had provided a terrifying clarity. He wasn't a victim of the island's malevolence, but perhaps a participant in its strange, cyclical nature. His death was a release, and now he was showing her the path to her own. Eleanor, still on her hands and knees, pushed herself up. Her body ached, her mind screamed, but a flicker of defiance ignited within her. This wasn't an external enemy to be fled from. It was an internal prison, built from her own trauma, amplified by Alcatraz. She had to fight, not the ghost of Thorn, but the ghost within herself. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse but gaining strength. "You don't control me." The entity paused, its swirling forms momentarily stilling. It seemed surprised by her resistance. "You are nothing but my fear," Eleanor screamed, finding a primal strength she hadn't known she possessed. "My guilt, my regret, and I will not let you consume me." She closed her eyes, forcing herself to confront the images the entity had conjured. The face of her deceased loved one, contorted in agony. The moment of her failure, replayed in excruciating detail. Instead of recoiling, Eleanor focused. She allowed the pain to wash over her, but this time she didn't drown in it. She acknowledged it. She accepted it. "Yes," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I failed. I carry the guilt, but I am not defined by it." As Eleanor spoke, the entity seemed to recoil, its form flickering, becoming less solid. The accusatory whispers faltered, replaced by a low, frustrated hiss. Her acceptance of her past, her refusal to be broken by it, was stripping the entity of its power. This was a battle of wills, a desperate struggle for the very core of her sanity. The entity, sensing its weakening grip, launched one final desperate assault. It projected a terrifying, vivid hallucination directly into her mind. Eleanor found herself standing in a sun-drenched field, her deceased loved one before her, smiling, their eyes filled with warmth and peace. They reached out a hand. "Come, Eleanor," they whispered, their voice a soothing balm. "Join me. All the pain will be gone. Forever. Just step into the light." The promise of eternal peace, of an end to her suffering, was almost irresistible. It was the ultimate temptation, a siren song to her deepest despair. Simultaneously, another vision slammed into her. She saw herself, years later, confined to a padded cell in a sterile white room. Her hair was matted, her eyes vacant, her body thin and trembling. She was muttering incoherently, rocking back and forth, forever trapped in a mental Alcatraz, the whispers her only companions. This was the alternative, surrender to the entity, and this would be her reality. Eleanor gasped, caught between the two terrifying realities. The peace offered was a lie, a path to oblivion. The future shown was a nightmare, a fate worse than death. She looked down at her hands, still clutching the wooden bird, which now pulsed with a frantic, desperate energy. This was the entity's last gambit, its final attempt to break her. "No!" Eleanor screamed, a guttural roar that echoed through the cell block. She threw the wooden bird away from her, a symbolic rejection of the entity's hold. I choose life. I choose to fight. I will not be your prison. She forced her eyes open, refusing to succumb to the beautiful lie or the horrifying truth. She saw the cell block, cold and stark, but it was real. She felt the rough concrete beneath her fingers, the damp air on her skin. She was here. She was alive. And she was fighting. As Eleanor screamed her defiance, a blinding flash of light erupted from the wooden bird where it lay on the floor. The malevolent glow intensified. Then, with a sharp, cracking sound, the light imploded, drawing the swirling, grotesque entity into itself. The air shimmered, distorting, as the shadowy forms of Thorn, her loved one, and the judging doctor were violently sucked into the small wooden carving. The cacophony of whispers and accusations shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, before being abruptly cut off. The light faded. The wooden bird lay inert, its surface now charred and cracked, but still radiating a palpable sense of dread, a contained malevolence. The air in the cell block was still, the oppressive silence returning, but this time it felt different. Cleansed. Eleanor collapsed, physically exhausted, every muscle screaming in protest. Her mind was a raw, exposed nerve, but the terrifying visions were gone. The whispers had ceased. The phantom weight on her chest had lifted. She was scarred, undeniably so, but she was free. She had faced her demons, not by fleeing them, but by confronting them head-on, by choosing sanity over surrender. The battle was won, but the war, she knew, would leave its lasting marks. The silence that followed the entity's implosion into the wooden bird was profound, almost deafening. Eleanor lay on the cold concrete floor of the cell block, gasping for breath, her body trembling uncontrollably. Every muscle screamed. Every nerve ending felt raw and exposed. Her mind, though no longer assaulted by the terrifying visions and whispers, felt like a landscape ravaged by a hurricane, scarred, desolate, but undeniably still standing. The wooden bird, charred and inert, lay a few feet away, radiating a faint, palpable sense of dread, a contained malevolence that was a stark reminder of what she had just faced. She didn't know how long she lay there, adrift in the aftermath. Hours, perhaps. The storm outside had died down, replaced by a gray, mournful dawn. The first rays of light, pale and weak, filtered through the high barred windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the darkness that had consumed her. Eleanor slowly, painfully, pushed herself up. Her limbs felt like lead, but there was a new, fragile strength in her resolve. She was alive, she had fought, and she had won, at least for now. Her first act was to retrieve the wooden bird. She picked it up, its surface rough and cool, no longer pulsing with malevolence, but still unsettling. It was a trophy of her battle, a tangible piece of the nightmare she had overcome. She then made her way to the dock. Ben's body was still there, a tragic monument to the entity's reach. Eleanor knelt beside him, a fresh wave of grief washing over her. But this time, it was clear, untainted by the entity's manipulation. She closed his eyes, a silent promise to honor his sacrifice. Later that morning, a small official-looking boat arrived, dispatched by the Historical Society after her prolonged silence. They found Eleanor, gaunt and disheveled, but lucid, sitting beside Ben's body. She offered no explanation for his death, knowing they wouldn't believe her. She simply stated he had suffered a sudden, fatal heart attack. They accepted it, perhaps too readily, eager to dismiss the grim realities of the isolated island. As she stepped onto the boat, leaving Alcatraz behind, the island no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a battleground she had survived. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a quiet, almost respectful stillness. She carried the weight of what she endured, but also a newfound understanding of her own resilience, a strength forged in the crucible of absolute terror. The transition back to the mainland was jarring. The noise, the crowds, the mundane routines of daily life felt alien after the profound isolation of Alcatraz. Eleanor sought therapy, not to erase the experience, but to process it, to integrate the horror into her understanding of herself. She spoke of her personal tragedy, finally giving voice to the grief she had suppressed for so long. She never mentioned the ghost, or the wooden bird, or Mr. Henderson's disappearance. Those were her secrets, the indelible marks of a war fought in the shadows of her own mind. Months turned into a year. Eleanor, though scarred, began to rebuild her life. She returned to her academic work, but with a renewed purpose. Her research on Alcatraz, once a desperate escape, now became a profound exploration of human psychology under extreme duress, the fragility of sanity, and the echoes of trauma. She poured her experiences, subtly veiled, into her writing, becoming a respected expert in the field of historical psychology. Her groundbreaking book, The Architecture of Despair, Alcatraz and the Fracturing Mind, was a critical success. In the epilogue, she included a seemingly innocuous footnote about the strange wooden bird she had found in her quarters, describing its unique carvings and its unsettling presence. She attributed it to a forgotten inmate's superstitious trinket, a detail meant to add historical flavor. Then, one crisp autumn morning, a package arrived at her university office. It had no return address. Inside, nestled on a bed of shredded paper, was a single, rusted prison shiv, a weapon that was unmistakably Thorne's, the same one described in his file. Attached was a note, scrawled in a shaky, aged hand, eerily similar to Mr. Henderson's final message. "You can leave the island, but the island never leaves you." Eleanor stared at the shiv, a cold dread seeping into her bones. It was a message, a warning. The entity, though contained, was still out there, its influence reaching across the bay, a subtle reminder that her victory was perhaps not as absolute as she had hoped. The final chilling twist came a week later. Among her fan mail, a thick, official-looking letter stood out. It was from a remote, isolated research facility in Antarctica, a place known for its extreme conditions and cutting-edge psychological studies. They had read her book. They were requesting her expertise on a newly discovered ancient artifact unearthed from the ice, an artifact that, according to their preliminary sketches, bore an identical carving to the wooden bird Eleanor had found in Alcatraz. Eleanor stood by her office window, the letter clutched in her hand. Outside, the city bustled, vibrant and alive. But in her mind, she saw the desolate, ice-bound landscape of Antarctica, a new island of isolation. She saw the ancient artifact, its carvings mirroring the malevolent eyes of the wooden bird. And for a fleeting moment, as she looked into her own reflection in the darkened window pane, she saw not just her own scarred but resilient face, but the tormented wide eyes of Elias Thorne staring back from her own reflection. The entity wasn't confined to Alcatraz. It was an ancient, parasitic psychological force that traveled the world, seeking out vulnerable minds in isolated places. And Eleanor, the survivor, had now inadvertently led it to a new host, a new battleground, and perhaps a new cycle of despair. The war, she knew, was far from over.